Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. During World War II, massive efforts were made to protect children. The most extraordinary of these were the kinder transports, which brought 15,000, mainly Jewish children, from Europe to Britain. In Britain itself, children were evacuated from cities to the countryside under Operation Pied Piper. But the same thing happened in Australia, with thousands of Australian children evacuated away from coastal areas to inland to live with relatives and friends. Joining me to discuss the experience of Australia's World War II child evacuees is historian and author Anne Howard. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Anne.
Hello, Georgina, and thank you for inviting me to talk about my book.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Your book, A Carefree War, details the experiences of these World War II child evacuees, and I think a very much underappreciated episode in Australian history, the experiences of children and women who were left in Australia when so many men went off to war. We're used to stories of the battles that Australian soldiers were involved in, and of course the big things like the fall of Singapore and all that was going on in the Pacific and closer to home, and even stories of the Japanese subs in Sydney Harbour. But what were the mothers and grandmothers and children experiencing at home is, I think, a little-known story.
Well, interwar was a very quiet time for most Australians, and they were mowing their lawns, preparing food which was delivered. Only 4.4% of women were employed outside the home in 1933, but there were distinct signs of Japanese expansionism, and governments tried appeasement through trade. And in the late 1930s, Japanese were allowed access to iron ore deposits in WA, which was an unpopular move. Then came accounts of the rape of Nanking, the old Chinese capital, in 1938, which left Australian citizens in no doubt as to what would happen to them in the path of this army. The Japanese ambassador, Tatsuo Kawai, published The Goal of Japanese Expansion, with Japan as a pioneer of a new age. And Japan had third largest navy. It had withdrawn from London naval peace treaties and aligned herself with Germany and Italy. And she moved into northern Indochina on the pretext of stopping war supplies to China. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, there was the fall of Singapore in February 42. And then the Japanese Imperial Army moved swiftly up the Malay Peninsula in a crab claw movement towards Australia. And as Robert Menzies said, in Europe it was the Far East. In Australia, it was the Near East.
Yes, it really paints a picture, doesn't it, of how concerned Australians must have been about what could happen if Japan did invade Australia, and that sense that they were very much approaching our continent. Can you tell me about the families in Australia who ended up being part of the child evacuees? Who were these children, and what were the households they were living in, and where were they living?
Well, really, it was a time where you had to survive. I mean, it didn't really matter whether you lived in an affluent suburb or not. If you were near the coast, you were seen as being under threat. I mean, they had rolls of barbed wire on Manly Beach. Can you imagine that? It was brought home all the time. There were quite famous children were evacuated. And then there were families of 10 that were trying to get enough money to pay the train fare up to Grandma's farm. So it was a wide range of children. It was the leveller of, we have to survive this. I mean, they were totally unprepared because it had always been the assumption that war would not be fought on Australian soil, and they'd sent a million men over to help the empire and wool and other supplies, but never thought that this would be a theatre of war.
No, and then that sense that there weren't really many men around in Australian families. The father was out of the house, the brothers, if they were a certain age, were out of the house. So it was the mothers and often grandma, Nana, looking after the children by themselves in the house, wasn't it?
Yes, and they used to sort of club together as well, because in those days, being a single child was a bit frowned on, and so they tended to have larger families and club together. I suppose people do that nowadays, but it was more so in those days because they had a simpler life and social life to them was more important, wasn't it?
Yes, I guess so. There wasn't the distractions of television, let alone iPads and the internet and
Yeah.
social media. So, yeah.
Different time. So when it came to go, they would clump together. Sometimes half a street would go, or sometimes the aunties would get together. And some of the women had joined the services, the land army and nursing. And if they were mothers, they'd left their children to be looked after by sisters and grandmothers and that sort of thing. So a lot of them were kind of composite groups of people.
So, and tell me about when these evacuations started to begin and why, I guess. I mean, was there a single incident that occurred that started the process, or was it just a gradual kind of contagion effect?
Well, some children were evacuated before war was even declared. And this is how I described them sitting around the kitchen table looking at the map. The map quite clearly showed that the top of Australia was really under threat. So there was that. Then there was the heavy censorship that came. It was clumsy censorship, and the Australians just learned to be very distrustful of any pronouncement that was made, and that was often conflicting as well. So they really felt that they were thrown on their own resources. So one boy told me that he read in a local paper that the Japanese had shelled some houses, but there was no damage. So he got on his bike and rode around there. And of course, he saw the front of a house blown up with the bed hanging over with the sheets, like a doll's house. You know, those pictures you see from the war then? And he thought, well, how come? Isn't that damage? And you see, people got very distrustful that they couldn't read what was actually happening. And some of the playing down that they did, like the bombing of Darwin, it still exists today. People don't realise how bad it was.
No.
It kind of rewrote history by leaving things out, omission. Yes.
It's interesting, Anne, in Britain, the government ran the evacuation program of children from British cities to the countryside under Operation Pied Piper. It was quite a well-organised effort, whereas in Australia, this was really largely run by individual families. It was up to the decision of individual families to make arrangements, wasn't it?
Well, there's two things I'd like to say there. One is, have you heard of the Brisbane Line?
Yes.
Well, above the Brisbane Line was a state of war, and they moved troops up there, and people went round knocking on doors and telling people to evacuate. That was shops, farms, houses, everything, as far as they could. And below the Brisbane Line was a different story because there were no official guidance or anything from the officials to help them decide what to do because they couldn't, because they didn't have any large-scale buildings inland where they could put them. I mean, they put up some internment camps, but they didn't have the manpower or the time to set up big enough camps to accommodate thousands of children, did they? They couldn't do it. You see, they were totally unprepared. And so this is why people were thrown on their own resources, really. And I think you and I would probably have done the same.
You yourself were a child evacuee, I understand, from London in the early 1940s. You were just an infant then, but you were obviously part of Operation Pied Piper.
Yes, I was. Well, my father and my uncles were all away fighting for the duration, and my mother and I were sent down to Cornwall to a big old house like the one in Rebecca. Whether I remember that or it's them talking afterwards, because I was only little, but I do remember all the children at the railway station they had these big labels tied to their collars with their names on, and all the women were all crying. I do remember that. And they did move an enormous number of children. A lot of them went up to Wales, and some of them had terrible experiences. And I think it was quite different from the Australian experience because these little children, they were put on a train with their labels on without their parents and sent to the town hall, and then local people would come and choose the children to take with them. And so in the country, they'd choose the teenage boys because they could work on the farms.
Yeah.
And the little girls, because they were sweet, and the others would be left in the middle. And some of them were treated badly, and they actually sued the government about maybe 15 years ago, something like that. In Australia, the children went with their mother, their aunts, and they stayed with their grandmother. So that's why I called it a carefree war. So most of the experiences of the children were positive and happy.
Yes.
Obviously not all of them, but a lot of them were.
So you didn't have instances where a family would send children away to some unknown foster family in Australia, unlike the experience, of course, in Britain?
Well, because families were much closer, it was more of a tribal kind of society in those days. They often had a grandma in the country or friends, close friends that they sent them to. But as I say, usually there was a member of the family with them or they were going to relatives.
Yeah.
Quite a different scenario.
And you talk about how above the Brisbane line, so in the northern part of Australia, Australia was in a state of war and there were well-organised, coordinated efforts to evacuate children.
Yes.
But obviously south of that, and really where the majority of people in Australia lived, it was very much a family decision to move away from the coast and go inland to a grandmother's house or the like.
Yes.
Do you think that there was an element of hysteria? For example, families in Melbourne or families in Tasmania even, they were moving away from the coast. Was there an element of hysteria or was there...
I didn't detect that. Of course, you get individuals who can become hysterical very easily, of course. But in the main, it was keep calm and carry on. But they did feel the pressure to get away quickly. And as soon as there was a bit of a submarine movement and a bit of shelling off the coast, they just left. You know that because the New South Wales officials actually came to the party in 1942 by putting forms into schools which you had to fill in if you wanted to evacuate your children, and they were going to help with hosts and this sort of thing. And only 12% of the people signed the forms because they'd already made up their mind and gone by the time they put the forms into the schools, which were half empty anyway.
Did you get a sense of the extent of how many families were leaving coastal areas to go inland? Was it a large proportion of the community?
Well, I don't know proportionally, but I'd say there were thousands because you read, 4,000 children were evacuated up in Queensland from one centre. So it becomes very, very quickly a large number. But you would have streets where nobody had gone, and then you'd have a whole street where everybody had gone. It was just very much up to the individual to make the choice. And one thing about moving the children was that in those days, real estate wasn't manic like it is now, and you could buy a house in the country. And also, if there was a deceased estate in the family, like, say, a house up in the Blue Mountains, for instance, they would leave it empty and go up there for holidays and they wouldn't bother to rent it out. I'm talking about ordinary working people. It was quite a different scenario finding somewhere. And some places got really clogged up, like Armidale was a favourite place to go. So people started being paid to look after families, to host families up there. And you see the adverts in the paper. They would offer to put people up and they could go to the local schools and they doubled their enrolments and they couldn't cater for all the children that wanted to enrol in their schools at Armidale.
You said the New South Wales government was involved in some respects with the evacuation, but was the federal government concerned about a sort of contagion effect? I mean, there was obviously efforts to censor what was actually going on in terms of the war with the Japanese. Was there a concern that if people observed thousands of families moving out of the area, that there might be some sort of mass panic?
Yes, there were a few remarks in the paper about mass evacuation wasn't a good idea. And they had seen pictures in Europe, in France, where you've got huge queues and trails of people with carts and dogs, and they're all packed in together with all the bags and the sick people sitting on the top. I think they had that image in their mind, but that never happened here because people would go in a truck or a car. There weren't many cars in those days, by the way. I think 1 in 4 families had a car in the 40s, but lots of people had trucks because they used to do home deliveries and that sort of thing. So the most popular would be a truck with a combined family in the back. And of course, the children thought it was lovely. They thought they were going on holiday. Oh, good, we're going to grandma's, no school. And they've got their Marmite sandwiches and they're sitting in the back having a lovely time. So it was nothing like those dreadful scenes in Europe, nothing like that. But I think the officials thought that they might be. And obviously they weren't going to one destination. They were going all over the place.
Indeed. I mean, this happened as far south, of course, as Tasmania. I was quite, I think, surprised to read that there were enemy mines found near the mouth of the River Derwent.
Yes.
And a Japanese submarine-launched seaplane flew over Hobart in March 1942. So the Japanese were getting as far as Tasmania. I mean, was that ever going to be a likely scenario that the Japanese would actually invade Tasmania, such the families, their concerns were well-founded?
Yeah, well, who knows? I mean, it was anybody's guess, really. I mean, the government plumped for the top of Australia, and there was definitely something in the air about an invasion because it had been discussed in the Japanese parliament way back, and they'd asked, were the Aboriginals good for a workforce, for instance? And they'd obviously thought this through. In fact, a submarine was captured, and it had a map in it, and where I lived in the Hawkesbury River, there's the big bridge that goes, the Hawkesbury River Railway Bridge, and it was on the map with a red circle around it. And the evidence seems to be that the Japanese Navy was very keen on invading, whereas the army wasn't, for the obvious reasons of lines of supply trying to go across the huge interior of our island continent made it impractical. But the thing is, you can't depend on expansionist powers to make rational decisions. I mean, Hitler marched on Moscow, didn't he? Well, that wasn't a rational thing to do, was it, if he did it? So you have to be prepared for the worst case test, don't you, really? And with Tasmania, of course, they had a record of invaders since the Europeans came, and they already had coastal batteries linked with tunnels, which had been built by the convict labour at the beginning. They're still there, boarded up, by the way. And they were in fear of attack from the sea because the naval raiders Penguin and Atlantis had laid mines, as you said, and spy planes were spotted as well. And they had the zinc industry, which was vital to the war effort. So they felt isolated and open to attack from the sea. And they had school air raid shelters and slit trenches, and a private school was evacuated onto the Central Plateau for 2 terms. And everybody around Australia had their own pet theory of why the Japanese would land there. And they could be Geraldton or they could be Newcastle. There were all these good reasons why they would suddenly land there. So a lot of small defence measures were taken, irrespective of the government, just done by councils and concerned people around the coast. And also they didn't know when they were going to come. So that would added to the anxiety of the parents. They were more or less looking out of the window. I mean, one woman lived in a farm up in Queensland and there was a hill and they'd taken her rifle away. They collected guns at one stage. She had no rifle. She had little children and the men were all away from the farm, husband and the workers. And she looked at this hill every morning thinking that there might be Japanese parachutists landing on it.
Wow.
They lived with the fear. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you look back at it, isn't it?
Yes, as I said earlier, it's certainly not a part of the familiar story of the experience of World War II in Australia, the sense that Australians really felt personally under great threat. The situation in Queensland, as you said, there was the concern of the Brisbane line, was much more serious, of course, than the situation in the rest of the country. What were the incidents that really led to the Queensland government and the federal government taking the actions they did in Queensland in terms of evacuating children?
Well, on one hand, they were trying to calm the population and censor everything, so to minimise everything that was happening. And on the other hand, they were quite aware of what was going to happen. And I knew somebody who used to mow the lawn for one of the ministers, And he said if the invasion happened, the New South Wales government had made plans to move to Bathurst, for instance. So the officials were working on two levels, really. And once they invited MacArthur in and he became Supreme Commander and they started moving troops up there, they must have felt that they were actually doing something to be prepared for this possible invasion, mustn't they? So I think it was not one single thing, Georgina. I think it was a combination of things that happened, and the writing was on the wall, really.
Of course. When Horn Island in Queensland was heavily bombed, this was then catalyst for the Queensland government commandeering ships for evacuation. And
Coastal shipping, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been a terrifying moment for families given only half a day's notice to get out of areas that were under
or half an hour's notice in Darwin when they were bombed. One little girl told me about, she was on Thursday Island and they were evacuated by ship, and her grandfather had come out as a Chinese pearler in the 1880s, and here she was on this ship with just the women and the children waving goodbye to the men. They were all crying and they had handkerchiefs which they put pennies in so that they could throw them down to the men, and they were singing the Thursday Island song. Would you like to hear how I actually started to write this book?
Yes, please.
It just dropped into my lap because I love listening to people's life stories. I always have done, and I talk to everybody and encourage them to talk to me. And this particular morning, Andrew Kyle, who was working along the river, sat on my veranda for a chat, and he said, I was a rabbit boy. And I was intrigued, and I said, what was that? And he said he was evacuated. And as we've already discussed, I knew what evacuation was. Andrew said he and his two brothers were taken to Oberon for 9 months to family friends because of the Japanese scare. And he said, we stayed in their shack on about 100 acres, none of them any good. We went up there in an old whippet loaded up. Their shack roof was lined with chaff bags with creatures running along inside. There were no doors, just bits of hessian hanging down. It was 6 miles out of town along Shooters Hill Road. Peas were the cash crop. A couple of hard-bitten daughters sat on rocking chairs on the veranda taking pot shots at birds. There was a wind-up gramophone with one record for entertainment. My little brother was 2 years old and still in nappies, and we two had to change him when we couldn't stand it anymore. The lady of the house was a short-order cook in town and left in a sulky before dawn. For breakfast, we had a bit of bread or toast smeared with butter or dripping. There was no electricity, so we would need to get the fire going first, and our toaster was a fork made from a bit of fencing wire. There was a cool guardie safe and a chip heater. Water was always scarce. The old bloke was a bush carpenter and put up sheds. He only had one eye, but he knew where the traps made from loops of fencing wire were. He had a very sharp knife. There were lots of snakes as we walked the property, and we were warned to keep away. We boys were from the city and stood aghast as he grabbed a screaming rabbit and cut his head off. He'd wring the paws and deglove the rabbit of its skin, and these were sold to make akubra hats. They had a few mangy dogs which were thrown the carcasses. Every night we had rabbit for dinner, every way you could think of, roast, stewed and fried. There was an old motorbike, rusty, with both wheels missing in one of the paddocks. I used to stare at it and think if I could find 2 wheels, I'd be out of there. 2 Italians.
So not such a happy experience for Andrew Kyle then?
Oh, no, he said he enjoyed it.
Oh, right.
I think he was trying to shock me with these dear little boys, because you haven't seen the pictures in the book, but these little boys were so cute, and well looked after and everything. Why their parents dropped them off is their father drove them up there and then drove off and left them there. And I mean, it sounds absolutely dreadful. But kids are kids. They found their own way to make fun. They did.
I wonder if he ever had rabbit after that. He probably
no,
was
I don't
sick
think
of it.
I don't think so. But lots of people depended on rabbit when they were on these subsistence farms.
Of course. Were there other humorous stories of children that you collected in the Carefree War?
Yes. I thought this was a funny story because I had 3 boys myself to get up to. So this is Stan Gratt from WA. He said, We were warned at school to steer clear of army installations, and we thought about those bayonets the guards had on their rifles. This warning eventually wore off, and we got quite cheeky, as all boys do. I know we climbed over the 2-metre-high sandbag walls around the American setup and got into the gun pits. There were boxes of 30 caliber ammunition in steel clip belts in boxes in the walls. We'd peel a yard of ammo off and skedaddle over the wall. We'd pull some to bits to see how they worked, chuck some in the fire to hear the bang, or swap them with your mates for perspex or whatever you could get. I guess that sort of thing goes on wherever there are armies, and I expect boys pinched gunpowder off Napoleon's soldiers. And, of course, everybody had air raid shelters. Here's a funny story about that. Bill Martin's family left Townsville to stay with Aunt Lottie in Brisbane. She had an air raid shelter full of food in case of the invasion. Most afternoons, Bill and his cousin Harry raided the shelter and took tins of condensed milk, sardines and bully beef to snack on. When the war was over, Aunt Lottie said, "We'd better get the food out of the shelter," and no tins were left. Harry and I were in strife over that, and Aunt Lottie said, "What would have happened if the Japanese had invaded?"
Well, indeed, yes. Yeah. You'd cleaned out your supplies before the disaster struck. I'm interested, Anne, in the experiences of the children once they had evacuated other areas, be they inland or from Townsville to Brisbane. I mean, they were there for some time and, of course, should have been at school. Was their schooling greatly affected, or were they able to slot into local schools in the areas?
I think really there was such a variety of experiences with the schooling. That wasn't always so happy because, children don't really like to move school and their friends at any time. How they were accepted by the other children, for instance, Shirley Davis told me, "I remember great excitement at school," this is in Victoria, "because one little girl was evacuated from Alice Springs, which we felt was very close to the war. We sewed handkerchiefs for soldiers and we thought she should be given one."
Well, that was very nice of them. Very welcoming.
So there was some interesting, well-known household names, really, who were evacuated, and it did affect their life. I think with some of these creative type people, it wasn't a good experience for them. Shirley Hazard, the novelist, was evacuated from Mosman to Penrith, and she spoke gloomily to friends about having to help with the cows. So that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but then you had a Randolph Stowe. He was born in Geraldton, and he was evacuated to other family properties in the hinterland. And his novel, The Merry-Go-Round in the Sea, is the story of that. So that's a first-hand experience. And then Grace Perry, the poet, she was evacuated from Sydney to Goulburn for 2 years, and her unhappiness at this time led to echoes of loneliness in her works. And Kerry Packer, he was sent out to stay in, I think it was Dural, and he got bitten by a mosquito and he ended up in an iron lung with polio and had a terrible time. And I don't think his parents went to visit him very much. So he had a lonely and disrupted childhood, and I think that absolutely affected him. Here's a sad little story. Let me tell you this one. Peter Daly. I always think this is terribly sad. Peter Daly said there were eventually 6 children in his family, but at the beginning it was just him and his brother who were brought up as twins. His father worked at Wollongong and Port Kembla. That was considered dangerous. He had a married sister, Eileen, married without children, living at Cessnock, and we were taken up to their house backing onto the bush. We had our tonsils out just before going up. Eileen's husband was a coal miner and he got killed in the pit when I was about 8. But they were always good to us. It was about 300 kilometres to Cessnock, so communication was only by mail. Later, I found out that after about 3 years, our parents came to get us and there was a family row. Aunt Eileen said bitterly to my mother, "You can always have some more." This is what Mom did, 4 more in fact. And Aunt Eileen sadly referred to us two as my boys for the rest of her life.
Oh,
that's sad, isn't it?
Yeah. How many years were the children evacuated for?
And all different. It was all different times. Some of them that were sent away before the war, stayed for the duration, and some went for 6 months. It depended on the news that was filtering through. 1942 was the really important time where there was the most movement. But some of them went away more than once. They thought it had died down. They came back and they were sent away again. So everybody had a different experience.
I really enjoyed reading about the experience of a Melbourne school, St Catherine's, which was requisitioned by the Women's Auxiliary
WAF.
Australian Air Force, the WAF, to become a training base in 1942. And so the children of the school were then sent to Warburton in March 1942. I mean, it's similar to the happy experiences you talk about in your book, that the girls actually, it was a girls' school, they really liked being in Warburton, and they had experiences such as sticky buns for afternoon tea, the squares of pink and green blancmange, the midnight feasts of violet crumbles and Hilly's chocolates left by visiting parents, the rooster that woke one dormitory each morning, the craze for catching tadpoles, newborn lambs in the paddock nearby, visits to the fruit salad farm up the gully, cold winter mornings and soft mists. It sounds quite a lovely experience. And they were all in this together, that sense of community and strong bonds between the girls. And, of course, I'm sure the teachers as well who were with them in Warburton.
Yes. There's a lot of the schools, the whole school went, so they didn't lose their friends. So Shaw College, for instance, found a 2-storey hotel at Mount Victoria and moved pupils and boarders in. And the local paper shop had to suddenly get a supply of Kiwi boot polish because clean shoes were expected. And Jim White, who was there, he wrote home, because they gave me photos and letters from the time when I wrote the book. This letter said, "I have broken my glasses while playing with sledges. A boy would get on his bike and tow the sledge downhill. When he got up enough speed, he would try and tip the boy on the sledge off. Once I turned 2 somersaults and nearly busted my neck." And James Bretherton said it was so cold. This is up in the Blue Mountains, right? It was so cold some nights. We went to bed dressed in our uniforms over our pajamas plus football socks.
Tell me, Anne, though, about the problem of the shortage of teachers during this time, because a lot of teachers would have enlisted and gone off to war, and the schools would have been left pretty short-staffed, no doubt.
Yes, that's a very good point, that they were very short of teachers. And as you say, they went into the services where they had better conditions, really. So they pulled in retired teachers and had bigger classes, and they just had to cope with what they had, really. And the men being overseas, manpower, and all that became woman power.
Did you see more females enter the teaching profession during that time?
Enter? Look, I haven't looked at that side of it, Georgina, so probably not. I think they're either in the services or in the land army, keeping things going, or looking after children. And it was really survival time. It wasn't a time to start a new career, really. But that would be an interesting area to have a look at.
Tell me, Anne, about the role of the churches in the child evacuations. Were they very important in terms of organisation and support and the like?
There were loads of different committees and voluntary organisations that helped during this time. The Country Women's Association, I must make this point, they were absolutely marvellous, and they would get these poor, tired refugee children from the coast, and they would take over a pub and take over the top of the pub in the country so that the bottom of it could still function, and make sure that everybody had a nice bed to sleep in and hot tea and scones and all this sort of thing. And they were marvellous. And the Red Cross Association also, and the Scouts, and the churches, of course, were the same. They supported the social movement as much as they could. And, of course, they ran these missions. And I've got a story for you which some people will probably remember because it was in the papers. And this is a very positive story, and it was well covered in the press with a photograph of the little girl concerned. And her name was Joyce Jukes, and she was born up at the Roper River, And age 7, she was one of 22 children taken away because of the Japanese bombing. And they found themselves evacuated from Alice Springs to a mission house, which is run by the Methodists, at Mulgoa near Penrith. Now, her mother could not look after her because she was a ward of the state, but she followed her little daughter down and found a job at a guest house nearby. Now, these children, they were all mixed-race children, and they stayed for 7 years, and they integrated with the local community. They won 20 silver cups at Penrith High School, and they topped the class in some subjects. And then news came from the Department of the Interior that the girls would be sent back to Alice Springs and the boys to South Australia. And Joyce told me, we didn't want to go. We were happy at the mission, welcomed by the local community, and I loved Penrith High School. I was the class captain and I wanted to be a doctor. The children were planning careers and tears fell at the thought of parting with those that they loved, and there was a lot of protest. The Penrith Chamber of Commerce campaigned. The Teachers' Federation protested for the first time against segregated schooling, and Aboriginal politicians and Billy Hughes and Doc Everett and the noted tenor Harold Blair all joined in. And Mr. Moy, the Director of Native Affairs, it's a terrible title, isn't it, said they were going to be sent away because they didn't belong there. So Joyce said, I can't say anything bad about the mission, which was set up to protect children and women in need. But when the bus came to take us away, Mr. Roberts, a supervisor, pulled me aside and said, don't ask questions, Joyce. Run as fast as you can to your mother. I ran for my life while 21 crying and screaming children were loaded onto the bus. My escape from authorities was front page news and in the media for some time. And the Minister for the Interior bowed under pressure, and Joyce was allowed to stay with her mother, who in January had been staying with a friendly family at Pymble because the police were looking for her. And that became a lifelong friendship. And there's a photograph of Joyce on a white pony, and she had pretty brown curly hair and a lovely smile. So she won people's hearts.
Did she go on to become a doctor, I wonder?
Unfortunately, she didn't. She went back up top and...
oh, right.
No, that would have been the icing on the cake.
It would have, yeah. It's so interesting that there were those experiences bringing Aboriginal kids down from the missions into cities and contributing to a lot more mutual understanding of the situation that both sides were in. Yes. And again, that is not a really commonly known story.
Well, because there was a lot of them. And it's like when you hear about somebody, meeting them is a completely different situation, isn't it? So there were some good things that came out of that time, and a lot of friendships forged, sometimes lifetime friendships. And if your friends volunteered to look after your children, I mean, how grateful would you feel to those people? So grateful, wouldn't you?
The experience of some British child evacuees was not a positive experience. Were there
mixed experience?
Yeah, and I mean some was positive, but some wasn't. Were there very, very difficult experiences that some children have of abuse or neglect?
Oh yes, because some people up in the country who didn't believe that the bombing was so bad in London, they just didn't believe it. One story that sticks in my mind, I didn't know this, I read this about this little boy. He was sent to live with 2 maiden aunts out of London, and at night time he knelt by the bed to say his prayers, as they used to in those days, and he'd say, Dear God, there's a strange woman that comes to this house and she says she's my mummy, but please don't let her take me away because I love being with my aunts.
Tough for the mother. What about in Australia? Were there instances where children were not well treated?
I didn't come across anything like that. I mean, it was rough living at some of these subsistence farms.
The rabbit farm.
But everybody lived like that then. That wasn't thought of as unusual. Here's a story about John Martin. My parents must have really thought the Japanese were coming. They sent my sister Margaret and me to relatives at Casterton who had a farm on the Glenelg River. In fact, there were 3 farms belonging to the family members. I was 6. We stayed there for the best part of a year, and it was the happiest time of my life. They had a phone. I remember it being used once or twice while we were there. I think parents wrote letters. I don't think they ever rang. My uncle used to yell into it because it was high up on the wall. None of the farms had electricity. We had tank water. I don't remember seeing money. They traded rabbits and ate pigeon pie and vegetables and had cream and milk from the cows. Auntie Dot never left the kitchen. She just went from the bedroom to the kitchen and stayed there all day. They had 10 children. On the veranda was the biggest bath I've ever seen, and all the kids got into it. And the water was so dirty that my sister and I walked past it and got into the river.
Sounds very sensible. And did you have any other stories you wanted to share before we finish the podcast?
Oh, look, there's a book full of stories here. And I just loved them all. I didn't like it much at Grandma's. She got me up at 5 a.m. I had to feed the chooks, and every now and then she'd cut the head off one, and it would always be my favourite. And some of them refused to leave. Bev Kingston's the historian. She was one, and her mother wouldn't even go into the air raid shelter because she was frightened of spiders. So they used to get under the table with a mattress on the top. Anything happened. I remember the submarine nets that let the ferries through. When the Japanese came into Sydney Harbour, my parents had gone out and I was with my grandmother. She was the youngest of her family, born when her father was 60. I was about 4.5. We got under the table with a mattress on the top. After that, we were sent by train to my grandmother's sister's house at Kula. It seemed huge to us. Outside the house, there was a shed and a water tank. I remember running around in bare feet. I remember grasshopper plagues. The lady of the house had chooks and a turkey. When Christmas came, she killed the turkey and cooked it, but we wouldn't eat it and cried because it was our friend.
It's lovely to hear how the city kids learned about the country and I guess the different aspects of life in the country, killing your animals that you raise for food and all the things you had to grapple with in country life, lack of all the amenities you get in the city, running water and electricity and the like.
Well, of course, for the mission children that came down, it was an extreme experience because they were getting opportunities that they could never had at the top. Although they were looked after well, but they just didn't have what the city could offer. Penrith High School, they loved it because they could stretch their little wings and find out what they could do, couldn't they?
Yeah. Well, Anne, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's been lovely to hear about the experiences, mainly positive, of the child evacuees during World War II. And it's great that you published this book with Big Sky Publishing, and I recommend people seek it out, A Carefree War, and read it for themselves.
Thanks, Georgina. It was fun. Thanks.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.